Joining us on day 320 at GGY. We have a slightly different format today. It's not exactly a roundtable discussion. It's more of a discussion between the two of us. So today we have a very special guest, Ruki Fernando, human rights activist and author. We thought it's important to get Ruki for a discussion today because Monday was World Human Rights Day.
Tuesday.
Right? Tuesday was World Human Rights Day. And we thought this is maybe a time to examine the state of human rights in Sri Lanka. So thank you so much, Ruki, for joining us. I must say, like when we needed mediation, even in our own group at GGY, we turned to you because you helped us sort of understand a difficult topic some time ago when we, within the group, found it difficult to resolve matters. So thank you for joining us, Ruki.
Thank you for inviting and happy to join.
You're most welcome. So let me start by just giving a quick introduction. Ruki is a prominent human rights activist with decades of experience in documenting human rights violations, advocating for justice, and supporting victims in Sri Lanka. His work spans enforced disappearances, displacement, land rights, and the protection of marginalized communities, with a focus on promoting accountability and strengthening democratic institutions. Did we get that right?
Yes.
So, Ruki, how did you come about into this space? And maybe just tell us a little bit about how you started in this space.
When I was in school, I was part of a Catholic youth movement and also in my parish. So I think through that I got more concerned about people who are marginalized and people who are vulnerable. I think the approach was more charity at that time as a very young student, school student. But slowly, I think after I left school, I became more exposed to more injustices, and then I realized that there needs to be an approach that is more than charity, and that's how I got gradually involved in human rights.
Right. Okay. So, we have just seen the election of a new government, a new president, and they made certain pledges when they came into power, and so I thought we'll start with what your impressions are of the new government and what you expect to happen in terms of the human rights space under this government. Let me quickly remind you of the main pledges that the president made in his sort of policy speech in Parliament. He made 7 key pledges, and basically they were to put an end to radical politics, a transparent parliament, improve public services, restore trust, justice for victims, IMF staff level agreement, and break market monopoly. So these were the 7 key pledges that he made. Do you think there's room in there to address the types of issues that you have been dealing with? Do you think it goes far enough?
I don't think it goes far enough, but I think it does offer a lot of promise. That we can go forward. So I think it offers hope, and I think it offers possibilities for optimism.
Right.
But it definitely doesn't go far enough.
Okay. Because we saw that last week we had a sort of a discussion amongst our team about the positives and the negatives of the administration so far. I know it's early days, and we were talking earlier, and you said you're never going to get a perfect government, right? I mean, maybe the expectations are very, very high, but partly because those expectations were set by them themselves, right? They said, qualified team, new political culture, and very, transparency, corruption. So certain things have come into focus since they've come into power, and one key thing, which was an election promise, was that they were going to repeal the PTA. But now there has been like sort of mixed messages about whether they will replace it with something else, maybe they'll amend it, and what is your thinking on that? Do you maybe just explain how the PTA has affected, especially sort of vulnerable communities, and why that law should be repealed.
Right. I mean, I like to talk about the PTA. Yeah. I was also arrested by the PTA under the PTA about 10 years ago.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know that. Oh, okay.
And I was one of the luckier ones, I would say.
So because what were you alleged to have done?
I was on one hand alleged to have helped to reorganize the LTT, that is around 2014.
Wow.
And then I was also accused of causing discomfort to the government, which is a very strange allegation, because that is what many opposition politicians do. That is what many journalists do and activists do. I was also accused of sending information abroad and earning money, which also is not a crime. Not that they were able to
that's
show.
what journalists do.
Yes, but anyway, that they were not able to really proceed with that either. Anyway, I was released in a few days because there was a lot of opposition to it from within Sri Lanka and outside. And there was, even though I was released physically, I still had a travel ban, overseas travel ban on myself for about 1.5 years. So every time I had to go overseas for something related to human rights, which is why I usually travel, not for personal holidays or anything like that, I had to go to court and get court permission. And it became a bit ridiculous because I went and got permission to go abroad for a human rights event in Brussels. And after that, if I wanted, I could have stayed in Brussels, but I chose to come back, honoring the court permission that allowed me to go for about 2 weeks. And I presented myself before courts. But it went on, and I had to go before courts within a period of 1.5 years, about 14 times, just to go overseas, although I had honored my part of the commitment to return back each time. I also had a gag order restricting my freedom of expression, and my electronic equipment, including an iPad and a hard disk, were confiscated, also through a court order. So it took about 5 years for the case to close against me.
Right.
It was always hanging over my head. And then it took about more than 10 years for me to get back the electronic equipment that was confiscated from me. But I would say I was one of the luckier ones.
Right.
Among the many PTA victims. Because I know that there are PTA victims who have been in detention for up to 16 years and finally acquitted by Sri Lankan courts on the basis that they were not guilty. So PTA is a law that allowed for detention of Sri Lankan citizens up to 16 years without them being guilty of any crime. And after that, they have not been offered any apology, no acknowledgement, no compensation, no livelihood support, nothing, zero. So, and that's how bad the PTA is. Right. There are many, most of the people who were targeted by the PTA in Sri Lanka have been Tamils. And I think more recently in the last 5 years have been Muslims as well. And the other category is that generally dissenters. So I think I fall into that category of someone who was critical of the government in power. So that's why journalists, opposition politicians have been victimized by
Activists.
the PTA. So there has been a lot of analysis about the PTA. And I think this particular government has been very clear that they are going to abolish it. That is what it states in their manifesto, abolish the PTA. Now, I want to draw a distinction between 3 things that can be done with the PTA or with any such law. Right. So one is total repeal, which is abolishing it. Yeah. You take it away. The second is that you amend it or you reform it. Amending or reform certain clauses. That is like tinkering with it. Yeah. Third is you abolish it and you replace it with something new. So repeal is one, reform is one, replace is another. So there are 3 different things. And I think any government with a simple majority can do it. It doesn't require 2/3, it just requires a simple majority. Yeah. But what is mostly required is political will and political courage. And it seems at the beginning that the NPP had that. That is why it's in the manifesto to abolish, which means repeal. The manifesto doesn't refer to reform or replace.
No, they were very explicit. In fact, page 129 of their manifesto said, abolition of all oppressive acts, including the Prevention of Terrorism Act, PTA, and ensuring civil rights of people of all parts of the country. I think, there are other bad laws too. The Bureau of Rehabilitation, the Broadcasting Authority, so many bad laws. But they were explicit about the PTA and it's stated by name.
Yes, exactly. So, but that's why in the last few weeks and months, it's a bit worrying that a senior legal officer in the President's office, the Foreign Minister, and most recently the Justice Minister is talking about reform and replacing the PTA instead of talking about the commitment they have made in the manifesto to repeal.
Right.
So I think that is, on one hand, it affects their credibility because if you do something against what you say in the manifesto on one thing, it raises suspicion that that is what they are going to do in relation to everything or most things in the manifesto. So it's a trust issue. Yeah. But secondly, also it's about reluctance and lack of political will and political courage once you're in power to do the correct thing. You know, the JVP in particular, for a long time, has been against the PTA.
Yeah. Well, they've been victims to it too.
They also have been victimized by it.
Right.
No? So now when they are in power, to kind of roll back on it, I think is very bad for their credibility and for their integrity. But there are, I think, challenges with it. I think what is important is if there are challenges like related to acts of terrorism. We have seen that in Sri Lanka. There's no denial that we have seen acts of terrorism, whether it is the Easter Sunday attacks, whether it is suicide bombings in the central bank or trains and buses and all that by the LTTE, or whether it's acts of terror by state forces, like bombing of churches in Jaffna, for example, with refugees inside, and various other acts of terror by state forces. We've seen it and we've experienced it over the decades. So what we need government in power to tell us is what are the gaps in the existing legal framework. Yeah. And if there are any gaps in relation to preventing terrorism or responding to terrorism within the existing legal framework, I think it is right and just that we address it. But in my understanding is that we have a lot of laws addressing terrorism. We have laws related to hostage taking, terrorist financing, so all kinds of laws are there related to terrorism in addition to the PTA. We also have something called the emergency, possibility of president declaring emergency, situation of emergency, and subsequently declaring emergency regulations. But that has a check and balance because that has to be brought to the parliament. No, it cannot be emergency regulations. It can only be for a very short period of time. So we have all of that. So I don't feel that we need a PTA. That is why I feel that it should be repealed totally and not replaced or not reformed. But if a government in power feels otherwise, if they feel that there are kind of gaps in the legal framework, that in order to prevent terrorism or to respond to terrorism, then I think the government is obliged to point out those gaps. Then we can discuss whether it's possible to do some amendments, for example, to the penal code, because our penal code is very old. But we can consider having some amendments to the penal code after extensive public consultations, in order to make sure that it can address any threats of acts of terrorism.
Yeah. So say for argument's sake, if the PTA was repealed, are the existing laws of the land sufficient to deal with any act of terrorism or anything like that? So why would a PTA be needed?
In my opinion, the existing legal framework is sufficient to deal with any threats of terrorism, to prevent terrorism, and also to respond to terrorism. Yeah. But that's what I said earlier as well. If a government in power feels that it is not sufficient, it is up to the government to point out why it is insufficient. What are the gaps?
Right.
But our experience of the PTA, which is what the JVP has been saying for many years before they came into power, is that the PTA has been primarily used against ethnic religious minorities, Tamils in particular, and then Muslims, and dissenters.
Right.
So that seems to be the purpose of the PTA. Now, we can't just trust that the JVP is going to be different, because the whole purpose of laws, whole purpose of institutions is because we don't trust rulers, we don't trust ruling parties.
Right.
That is why we have laws and institutions. If we are just going to go by trust, that is not rule of law, that is rule of trust and on human goodness, benevolence, kings and queens kind of. We are not in that system anymore. So we are not going to go by trust. Right. Citizens will always be suspicious of people that they elect to power. Right. That is how it should be. Because rulers have proved again and again, not only in Sri Lanka, all over the world, that they cannot be trusted with power.
Yeah, well, I mean, if the system of government that we choose is democracy, then rule of law is absolutely key. and equal application of the law, good faith application of the law. I mean, that is what we need. So, during the last administration, apart from the PTA, which has been there for many, many years, we saw some new laws coming in. Why do you think those laws were brought in? Like, what did you think was the need for those types of laws? The Bureau of Rehabilitation, there's Broadcasting Authority bill. I mean, to us, it felt like these were sort of directly targeting activists, dissenters. It felt like democracy was backsliding with these types of laws.
Yeah, that I share that sentiment. That is my feeling as well. The way some of these laws were brought about indicates that they were not open for wide public consultations. So that itself indicates that these were meant to be tools of repression. And a tool of repression is not only for one government in power.
Right.
Citizens can change governments either in the streets or through elections.
Yeah.
And when the governments change, that tool of repression passes on to the hands of the new government.
Right.
So before it could have been Ranil Wickremesinghe, before that it was Gotabaya, before Maithripala Sirisena, before Mahinda, and now it can be Andhra Kumara. But after some years it can be someone else. So that is why we don't rely on the benevolence or the goodness of individuals. We rely on a strong legal institutional framework. That is why these laws that were brought, like, for example, the Online Safety Act, are very dangerous. Right. Even the Rehabilitation Bureau Act is very dangerous because it militarizes the concept of rehabilitation. So that is why they all have to go. And if this government, the NPP, is serious, they should repeal these laws, and they have all the possibilities of doing it in the next few months. And they should definitely not wait for the second part of their term. They should do it within the first few months, which is next year.
Yeah.
And now I think now that the parliamentary elections is done and dusted, it's the ideal time to move forward, repealing these terrible repressive laws.
Yeah, I mean, they came into power with a lot of hope and expectations. And, now that they're in power with a 2/3 majority, there's nothing standing in the way for them to sort of go through with the promises that they have made. I think the only area where there could be uncertainties is the economy, because there's just so many variables. But there are other things that in the manifesto that they can just simply take action because they have all the power they need.
Yes, that's what I think what they need is political will and political courage. And political courage also means, not the unwillingness to crack down on dissent.
Right.
It is very tempting for any government, particularly a government with as much power as the NPP, with a very strong executive presidency, and with more than 2/3 in the legislature, and a lot of hope in general in the country, and hope in them. That means a lot of power. So it's very tempting for them to cling on to the tools of repression, not to let them go.
Right.
I think they have to overcome that temptation to cling on to the tools of repression. And very disturbingly, we have seen that being deployed. Now, the PTA was already deployed twice in the recent past. One in relation to the incidents in Arugam Bay, and then most recently in relation to Mavi Runal. And we have seen also some magistrates pointing out that the PTA is not appropriate to be used. Right. So what we can have immediately in relation to the PTA is what I would say an executive moratorium. The executive branch of the government can decide that they will not use the PTA because they have found it to be very problematic, and they can rely on other laws. Right. I think the midterm solution in the next few months as such, early part of the next year, and the first part of the year for sure, is for the legislature to repeal it. So pending the repeal by the legislature, the executive can decide to have a moratorium or not to use the PTA.
Right. Well, I mean, the president sets the tone for his administration, and he sets out the agenda. Of course, we have seen some, judgments recently. One was the one, I think, that came out today that released Suresh Saleh from, not Suresh Saleh, Azad Saleh. Azad Saleh from a PTA case. So I think that alone demonstrates that, this PTA is well past its sort of sell-by date. And then the other one is that a magistrate releasing a member of the security forces from a case basically an extrajudicial killing. Now, we've seen many of that, the Maharashtra prison, the Valikada prison incident. I mean, so many cases of, extrajudicial killings. Do you think that there's sort of a certain amount of inertia in the system or, entrenched conventional sort of thought about how these things are tackled, and maybe not enough bravery when it comes to even the judiciary to take some decisions that need to be taken because if somebody was shot and killed by the forces, somebody needs to be held responsible, right?
Right. So I think there is two dimensions to it. One is what I would call executive convenience. Okay. The executive is the president, who is also the Minister of Defense, the Secretary to the Ministry of Defense, the armed forces, the police, including the Special Task Force. So they consider the judiciary a nuisance. Okay. For the citizens, it is the last bastion of hope.
Last resort. Yeah.
But we should not, in a situation, if we are to have good governance, democratic governance, we should not be compelled to go to the last resort. The reasons to go to the last resort should be absolutely minimized, and it should only be occasional. So that means the executive must act in good faith. So as long as there is these laws like the PTA, the executive will not act in good faith, because it is a very tempting tool of repression. The executive basically would like to detain people for several weeks and months. Right. In the past, it was years. Without judicial oversight. They want to have that power. But whereas in a democratic society, it is the judiciary that decides whether someone should be given bail or someone should be remanded. The police will tell their side of the story, producing a suspect to a magistrate, why this particular person should not be released on bail. The magistrate will listen to the police and will also listen to the suspect, often through lawyers. Yeah. Magistrate will listen to both sides and make a decision. So there is a difference between the police, who are the investigators, and the magistrate, which is the judiciary. That is the check and balance. Right. But what the police wants through laws like the PTA is absolute power.
Yeah, the removal of judicial oversight.
Yes, exactly. So that is for executive convenience. And that executive convenience has caused a massive amount of harm to Sri Lankan citizens. And what you quoted today, Azad Sali's case, where the Supreme Court have confirmed that in harm caused to Azad Sali, is one example. There have been many other examples. So that is when we know that has happened repeatedly, we cannot believe that the NPP or any government will not do it. That is why we cannot go on trust of rulers. We need to have strong laws and strong institutions that will ensure protection to citizens from those in power, irrespective of which person or which party is in power.
Right. I think that's the system change that people ask for.
Yes. It's not a person change, it's not a party change, it's a system change.
System change.
The oppressive system must change. Now, any system will have weaknesses. Yeah. That is why systems must be reformed and overhauled regularly. Yeah. But this is something that we have, PTA, something we have identified for over so many decades. And also, I think one of the things that needs to be done in relation to the PTA, in addition to the law, is the detainees. I think there is a relatively small number of detainees, no less than 50 probably under the PTA right now. Right. Some of them have been in detention for many years. I think if they have not been charged for many years, I think the police can decide to discharge them. If they have not been charged, it means that there is no evidence to charge them. The police should not be given the opportunity to go fishing for evidence just because they want to charge. In the course of the investigations, if they had come across evidence, people would have been charged already in a normal system. On the other hand, the Attorney General, if the Attorney General has already charged people, indicted people, has the opportunity to withdraw the charges if the Attorney General feels that these charges will not stand in a court of law. And we have seen under the PTA, for example, confessions that have been used against accused have been thrown out by the judiciary. Right. But instead of waiting for the judiciary to throw it out for years and years, the Attorney General can voluntarily withdraw them. Yeah, also, if the third category is people who have been convicted under the PTA, if they have already been there for 10 years, 15 years, I think the President has a possibility to pardon them. So that's also an option that the President can go down.
Right. I mean, if you look at the amount of cases that have been thrown out for the lack of evidence, I would question the evidence that has been presented in the ones that gain the convictions also. So I think it brings into question the process and the evidence, all of it, right? So I think all of it needs to be reviewed.
Yes,
and maybe, like you said, a pardon might be the way to go.
Yes, I mean, but of course, pardon must also follow due procedure.
Yeah.
In the past, even I have been among the petitioners to the Supreme Court, which insisted that presidents have the power to pardon, but there is a due procedure to be followed. No, they need to get reports from the judge who gave the conviction, the Ministry of Justice, and the Attorney General, and so forth. So I think any president has to follow that procedure, but presidents do have some degree of discretion to pardon people, and I think that this is one particular area, those detained for prolonged periods under the PTA, not just someone convicted last month or a few weeks ago, those who have been there for many years, to consider pardoning them. So that's also, because while we are talking of repealing the PTA, we must also think of the justice for the people who have suffered under it. And this is a category that I talked about, is people who are still in detention. And the second category of people we need to talk about is the people that I mentioned before, who have been in detention and who have suffered greatly, whose families have suffered greatly, but who have got not any justice.
Right.
Even the courts have found them not guilty, but they have been in detention for 10, 15, 16 years.
And no recompense of any sort.
Nothing.
So they've just been released and...
Yes.
Yeah.
So at least there must be an acknowledgement of the injustice that they had to undergo. The state must extend an apology, and then there must be other considerations like compensation, livelihood support, counseling, and various other measures to support them.
Yeah, I think that brings us to a very sort of uncomfortable topic, and this is something that even within our group we've had difficulty discussing, which is acknowledging past crimes and the ability for people to, for example, commemorate the dead and things like this. The final stages of the war, I mean, acknowledging those crimes is also admitting that, the government did wrong or the military did wrong. You've worked with these communities and the people who've suffered over the years. So this question of transitional justice, how important is that question? Because today there was an article that said, ensure justice and uphold the rights of the war-affected individuals. North and East Tamil's right to AKD on HR Day. Just to quote from it, under your leadership, for the first time in history, a government formed by the National People's Power, or Jathika Janabalawegaya, has secured an overwhelming majority. We firmly believe that your government possesses the authority to deliver lasting solutions to the various challenges and issues we face today. This is probably the first president that got a majority in the North and the East as well. So on the one hand, how important is the question of transitional justice and acknowledgement of what has happened in the past, and how much sort of will do you think that this government will have, considering what they gain, how they gain power in terms of addressing these issues?
I think the first thing to clarify is that this NPP didn't get a majority in the North and East.
Yeah.
NPP in the Northern Province got about 23% in the Northern Province as a whole. They were the party that got the single party that got the most number of votes,
got the most number of votes.
But that's only about, it's less than 25% in the Northern Province.
But historically looking at it, that's a bigger percentage than anybody else has gotten in the past, I believe, right?
Not necessarily. I think if you look at the historical trends, the two major parties have come close to it. It's usually the UNP and the SLFP, that have been the two major national parties. Right. They've always got some degree of votes in the Northern Province, especially with allies like the EPDP. So they have got some votes. So these, but it's still a significant margin where I think if you consider what the JVP, the NPP got in 2019 in the Northern Province, this is a massive increase. So it means the hopes in the NPP have gone very high in the Northern Province, as it has all over the island. So the percentage increase for the NPP is very high, and that has to be acknowledged. Although the overall amount of votes percentage they've got is not very high. It's the lowest in the country, whole country, and which shows that compared to other parts of the country, the degree of support and the trust the NPP has is still very low in the North and the East, where Tamils are majority, and in the Eastern Province in particular, where Muslims are also a significant number. Now that said, I remember that when President took oaths, He said that he understands the composition of the votes he got. And I remember him saying that, no, he understands that, and he wants to reach out to the people who didn't vote for him and who didn't trust him.
Right.
That is the presidential elections, no, when he was taking, just before taking votes. I don't know how much of that people understood in the North and East, because that was only in Sinhalese, unfortunately. But I believe that there is a hope, and there is also a possibility that this government can go much more of a distance than any other government that we have seen. That's my feeling. But there are a lot of challenges. I think there are challenges. One challenge is internal to the JVP in particular. JVP is the main constituency of the NPP. Yep. And now JVP has I think a two-dimensional history in terms of conflicts. One is that its own leader, Rohana Vijayveera, was extrajudicially executed while in Sri Lankan state custody. Right. And I think there were attempts at seeking judicial kind of justice for that, which has failed. But I think it's still possible to open up that case symbolically. If the JVP is unable to seek justice for the extrajudicial execution by the state in power at that time of his own leader, then there's a whole question of how much committed and serious they are about seeking justice and criminal accountability for others. Right. That's one, and many other JVP cadres, low-ranking cadres, suffered a lot. Extrajudicially executed or are subjected to enforced disappearances or terrible torture. I personally met JVP cadres who recounted horrible accounts of how they were tortured in torture camps in the late 1980s. Yeah. So that's one dimension, the suffering the JVP underwent, the state repression that they were subjected to. So they should understand state repression. Second is that they were also an armed group which inflicted a lot of, committed acts of terror.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So they could easily be called a terrorist group for committing all those acts of terror. And there are personal friends of mine who have suffered massively. Yeah. And there are people who are still demanding criminal accountability and justice for the terrible crimes that the JVP did. So in that sense, we could liken it to the LTT, because although the LTT called itself Liberation Tigers, a group fighting for liberation, they also have committed terrible crimes against Tamils, against Sinhalese, against Muslims, against all communities, particularly against people, Tamils, who dissented and criticized the LTT. So they had these similar traits, the LTT and the JVP. I think they are very different, but they did have similar traits of not tolerating dissent against them and being very repressive. Yeah. So I think the JVP also requires a very open, honest, significant acknowledgement of their past, of what they are responsible for. I don't think most of the people in the JVP at present are part of that. So that should make it, I think, relatively easy for them to acknowledge when the majority of people individually responsible are no longer with them.
Yeah, but they will point to the vote, the election outcome and say, look, people have put this behind them now. That, maybe, knowing what they know, they still brought them into power. So they might point it and say, look, that alone is an acknowledgement of, and that they have moved past that. How would you sort of...
We could also say the same thing for the Tamil political parties. Yeah. Since the end of the war, since the LTT was kind of wiped off, Tamil parties have always won most number of votes in the northern province.
Yeah. And they're coming more into the mainstream.
So we can say that, we can also say that same thing about them,
of course,
they have acknowledged that Tamil parties have mostly won most votes in the number of votes Tamil parties got reduced this time, but even this time, the Tamil parties got more votes than the NPP. Yeah. I mean, if you put them together, particularly in the northern province. Yeah. In particular also, the ITAC won. So I don't think democracy is about majoritarianism. The democracy is a lot about those marginalized groups, people who have suffered, people who are victimized. If people who are victimized are still claiming for acknowledgement, if still claiming for criminal accountability, I think we should support that process. Yeah. And I think the JVP in particular should be humble to acknowledge their past. Without acknowledging that past, I think it's going to be very difficult to move on. And I mean, similarly, in the case of the North and East, I think, for example, now we saw within the presidential elections and the parliamentary elections, we saw the president visiting Katuwapidiya Church. one of the churches that was bombed during the Easter Sunday attacks. Yes. I think there are different thoughts about it. Some there is a feeling that it was a political stunt aimed at getting more votes, but there's also a feeling that he went to show his solidarity with the people who were most affected, and we saw whatever the intention was. What I observed was that he listened very sensitively to the survivors and victims' families, and he had a discussion with them, irrespective of what his intention was. Would he dare to go to the Nawali church in Jaffna or the Guru Nagar church in Jaffna, which was bombed by the Air Force in the 1990s, and have a discussion with the survivors and the victims' families, who are largely Tamil? And as much as we are clear that those who bombed the Katuapitiya church in Negombo were Muslims, at least those who did the act, who implemented the act were Muslims, we also know for sure that those who bombed those two churches, Nawali and Guru Nagar, are the Air Force. So will the president, a Sinhalese president, have the political courage to go to those churches and have an open discussion and acknowledge those acts? And I'm just citing a couple of examples.
No, you're right, but because I mean, the fact that we are talking about it sort of breaks a certain taboo, because acknowledging sort of crimes committed by a state seems to be very uncomfortable for the people. So that's what I was asking. How important is that acknowledgement, especially for the people commemorating, and how important is their right to commemorate?
I think the acknowledgement is really, really important. No? And I think to some extent the very genuine, heartfelt, serious acknowledgement will, I think, mitigate demands for criminal accountability. Now, criminal accountability means that someone wants those responsible to go through a judicial process. And I think judicial processes are very important. There is no, I think, alternative to criminal accountability. But I think honest political acknowledgement will go a long way in reducing the demands for criminal accountability. And I think it will definitely contribute massively to ethnic reconciliation. And I think this is very true for, particularly for families who have been subjected to enforced disappearances. So I think there are many Tamils and also Sinhalese who want to know the truth. So they want to know whether their loved ones are dead or alive. If they are alive, they want to go and visit them or meet them wherever they are. And if they are dead, they would like to know the circumstances of the death. And they would like to get some remains, if that is possible. And this has been done in other countries. I attended personally a ceremony in an event in South Africa in 2013. I still remember that, although it was 11 years ago, where the remains of people who were subjected to enforced disappearances and later found killed were recovered and handed over to the relatives. And that would have been in the 80s or the 90s. That incident would have happened in the 80s or 90s. But that handing over the remains that happened, it was a very solemn kind of a cultural religious event in 2013. So even after many years, people are waiting for that. And I think that is the kind of thing that we need here for families of disappeared. There needs to be a acknowledgement about what happened. There needs to be, the truth needs to be told whether they are dead or alive. And I think it requires a humility, it requires a political courage. And unfortunately, I don't see the NPP leadership having that political courage or that humility. I hope I'm proved wrong.
We all do. I mean, I think it's incumbent on a government to act in good faith and serve all the people of the country. So I think if there is an aggrieved community, I think they need to agree. They need to address those grievances, and I think this is a key area. I mean, this is the national question. So, we'll wait and see.
Yeah, and along with that, maybe I want to flag the question of what we talked about in the last few minutes. Is about what I would say consequences of the war. Enforced disappearances, churches that were bombed, people who were killed, injured, tortured, and all that. People who were taken into custody under the PTA and detained for 15, 16 years and all that are all consequences of the war. But I think we also need to look at the causes of the war. I think addressing the consequences is not adequate to prevent future problems from happening. And I think for that we can go back to the history. In the 1950s, 60s, the name of the major political party at that time was the Federal Party. The demand was for a sharing of power some kind of autonomy within the framework of a united, not unitary, united Sri Lanka, one country. Sure. Essentially one united country, not a separate country. At that time, the form of struggle was also very democratic. There was Satyagraha, for example, on the Galle Face. That is what the Galle Face became famous for. More recently, the Galle Face became famous in 2022. But long before that, in the 50s, it was famous for the Satyagraha done by Tamil political leaders. And it was brutally set upon, and they were brutally attacked. I think later on, in the 70s, two significant transformations happened. One was the demand became a separate state. Right. And that is what this Vadukudai resolution is about. Yeah. And that was, I think, endorsed to a large extent by the 1977 general elections, where the TULF, who carried forward that demand from Vadukudai, got a massive number of votes. The second significant change in the 70s was that Tamil armed groups started. So the demand became from a federal power sharing arrangement to a demand became for a separate state. And the method from the peaceful kind of satyagraha became an armed struggle. And the armed struggle even evolved into groups that committed acts of terror. Right. So these two significant changes, I think we have to acknowledge. And in 2009, I think again we changed things. Again now I think the major Tamil political parties are talking about power sharing. Major Tamil political parties that I know who consistently got a lot of votes in the north and east, even though there has been ups and downs, are still talking about federal or confederal or some kind of a power sharing arrangement within a united Sri Lanka. They are not talking about a separate state anymore. So I think from 2009, this concept of separate state has gone away, kind of. That's my idea. And also the method of armed struggle has also gone away. Since 2009, we have seen people on the streets, people using social media, struggling peacefully for what they believe is their rights. So I think we need to ensure that there is an adequate response for this very reasonable political demand for power sharing and for this methodology of peaceful democratic struggle. Because if we don't have adequate response, someday down the line, we might again go back to a demand for a separate state. We might again go down the path of bloodshed. So we have to avoid that, I think, at any cost.
So you think the full implementation of the 14th Amendment, for example, will that be the 13th Amendment? Would that be the solution?
I don't think so.
With police powers granted as well?
No, I think what must happen is the 13th Amendment must be implemented immediately. Because the 13th Amendment is
we need
part
elections
of
first.
Huh?
We need the elections to happen, right?
Yes, of course, provincial council elections need to happen.
Yeah.
But even when we had the provincial council system, the 13th Amendment was not implemented fully. It was willful violation of the constitution by successive presidents. Right? Because 13th Amendment is part of our constitution.
And withheld certain powers only to those provinces.
Yes, but I think what we must look at it is as a willful, deliberate violation of the constitution. So we hope that at least this president will not engage in the deliberate violation of the constitution. That is the 13th Amendment.
Right.
I think that is the absolute minimum. But I think now the NPP has promised a new constitution in its manifesto, and I think that needs a little bit more discussion and public consultations and like that, debates. So I think eventually we need to go beyond the 13th Amendment. We need to have a significant degree of power sharing and autonomy. And we need to acknowledge that from the 50s and the 60s, Tamil people have been asking for it. They have not been asking for a separate state in the 50s and 60s. They have not been asking for a separate state 2009 to 2024 for the last 15 years. I think we need to acknowledge that, and we need to have Sinhalese community, need to have the political courage also, not just the government, but also the Sinhalese community to consider that. And to acknowledge what has happened because of our inability to consider that up to the 70s. So that is what has led to this bloodshed.
Right. I think through their actions, if they show that they are willing to be more inclusive in the way they address communal issues, address transitional justice issues, and so on, maybe you build enough trust and faith. You bridge those gaps that exist, and then maybe equitable sharing of power is possible.
I think it requires a lot of dialogue and discussion. I think there are doubts that people have. I think those doubts should not be swept under the carpet. And I don't think just because the NPP has a 2/3 majority that they should sweep under the carpet some of the doubts that people have about power sharing and anything. I think there has to be a dialogue. And that's why...
people gave them the power to provide solutions.
Yes. So that's why I think they also need to have the political courage to take some unpopular decisions. No? So now I think power sharing, autonomy, is often seen as a stepping stone to separatism. That's one school of thought, and I have heard many of my Sinhalese friends, I have heard many Sinhalese politicians talking about this doubt, that power sharing, confederal or no confederal, is stepping stone, first step towards separatism. But that's not the case. I think that's a false fear. I think it's quite the opposite. It's the lack of power sharing, federalism, or autonomy that led to a demand for a separate state. And Sri Lankan history teaches us that. If there was a serious consideration of a request for power sharing within the framework of one united Sri Lanka, we probably wouldn't have got a demand for a separate state in the 70s. So I think we need to learn the lessons of the history. But I think we need to engage with people who have doubts. But at the same time, I think government with so much power, more than 2/3, also need to have the political courage to do the correct thing. And so they need to push forward agendas that are not always popular. Now, the power sharing is one such agenda, I think. Acknowledging the atrocities that have happened during the war is another thing. But take something as simple as the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act. Now, that is something that has been in the debate for a long time. Now, we have seen representatives of the NPP government saying that they will not proceed with it. But I think that is another example of where they must have the political courage to do what is right, correct. Take amendments to the Penal Code 365 and 365A. Talk about the rights of the LGBTIQ community. So these are not necessarily things that might have popular support across the Sinhalese, Tamil, Muslim communities and religious leaders. And Sri Lanka is a very religious state, not only Buddhism, but we see so many Hindu, Christian, Muslim places of worship and people flocking to these. And some of these religious leaders are very conservative when it comes to certain rights. So administration that has more than 2/3 majority now and with a very strong executive presidency should not be guided purely by populist sentiments. They should do what is right, and that involves human rights. That needs respecting all rights of all people.
Right. Okay. So, looking ahead, how do you view the sort of the landscape for human rights advocacy in Sri Lanka? Are you because there are certain things that are still happening in terms of the Geneva Convention and so on, right? We have those resolutions coming. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. The very first stance that the government took against the UN resolution was that we will continue with the same stance. That was a little disappointing, but we felt, okay, early days, we still have the same ambassadors in place that appointed by the previous government and so on. How do you think we should sort of pivot in terms of how we do this internationally?
Right. I think, again, we need to think why this resolution at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva came about. It came about because there was inadequate justice in Sri Lanka. If Sri Lankan brothers and sisters, if Sri Lankan citizens who were aggrieved received adequate justice, if you take post-war in the last 15 years, then I think the resolution wouldn't have come about. So I think these rhetoric, emotional, political expressions of anger against the resolutions of the Human Rights Council in Geneva will not help. I think what must happen is actions on the ground. If what we talked about before, if acknowledgement for atrocities that have happened, if criminal accountability for atrocities that have happened, is taking place in Sri Lanka, I think gradually the need for resolutions at the Human Rights Council will die away. But very practically taking this particular resolution that is now there, at least till 2025 September, it's a mechanism to gather evidence to ensure criminal accountability. Now, on principle, NPP government is committed to ensure criminal accountability for crimes that have happened in the past. Now, most vocally we have seen them talking about Easter Sunday attacks.
Yeah, I was just coming to that. So
Right? And then also about crimes against journalists and so forth. But what is lacking in their, I think, discourse is about wartime atrocities.
Yeah.
That is lacking in their manifesto, and that is lacking in their public speeches by its leadership and all that. No? Now, evidence gathering through a professional way, as what is happening in the case of the resolution, could be helpful to ensure criminal accountability in Sri Lanka. If Sri Lankan authorities want to get evidence of a sufficient threshold and standard, they could discuss and negotiate with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, about using some of those evidence, which is now collected by them, in domestic processes. But that's, of course, have to be a discussion. It's not going to happen overnight, because the first people who gave the evidence must have the confidence that the Sri Lankan authorities will not subject them to reprisals.
So I think that they'll be protected in some way.
The fear of many people who have given evidence is that they will be subjected to reprisals.
But don't you think the NPP government can take courage from the fact that a lot of the nationalist, populist politics who fear-mongered and propagated conspiracies were defeated in the last election? Shouldn't that be sending them a signal saying that, okay, people are ready for that conversation now?
Yes, they should ideally get some courage and comfort from that.
Yeah, because
but they should have a more, I think...
Vimals and all of these guys who used to, thrive on international conspiracies and all of that, they've all been sent home, right? So I think...
Yes, but historically, JVP has been also similar in their opposition to any international involvement. No, what the JVP has not understood for a long time, I think, is that this demanding truth, demanding criminal accountability is a request of Sri Lankan citizens, our Sri Lankan brothers and sisters who have been massively aggrieved and who have not been able to find redress under successive governments. Now, we are not going to trust the JVP. Certainly, Tamils who have been aggrieved are not going to trust the JVP, because we must acknowledge that the JVP has a very bad record, particularly against the Sinhalese, but also against the Tamils. For example, in 2009 April, I think, when the Mahinda Rajapaksa government said that we will stop using heavy weapons because they will harm civilians, it is the JVP who said, no, you must still use heavy weapons. So that is the JVP supported the last phase of the war fully, between up to 2009. So JVP has a bad history of supporting the last phase of the war, irrespective of the suffering it caused to Sri Lankan brothers and sisters, Sri Lankan citizens.
Yeah, so I think it's incumbent on them to prove through their actions that they are ready to tackle this in good faith.
Exactly.
Right? I think, and through their actions, not just words.
Yes.
Because now they are the ones in power. They have all the power they need to do pretty much whatever they want. So.
Yeah. So that's what I said. Things on the ground, acknowledging what has happened takes political courage, takes political humility. I hope they will find it. They don't seem to be having it right now, but I hope they will find it in the coming months and years, particularly because they have such a strong power now in the legislature and executively, and also in popularly, socially. So I hope they will find that courage, and that also must be extended to look at the UN Human Rights Council resolution in a more objective manner, and also in a manner that is sensitive to survivors and victims' families. The UN Human Rights Council resolution is not about the diaspora. It's not about the US or the UK. It is about our brothers and sisters who have suffered greatly.
Of course, these are citizens. These are
our citizens.
Fellow Sri Lankans. But in your view, what are the most underrepresented human rights issues in Sri Lanka right now? Quickly.
So I think this is what I mentioned. The wartime dealing with the wartime atrocities is not only a past thing; it's a present thing. Families of disappeared are looking for their loved ones today. Political prisoners are languishing in prisons today. These are not things of the past. So I think those are the things that I think the NPP seems to be very reluctant to address. And I think now that the elections are passed, it's prime time to address these things. But then there are, I think, the other issues, like I think I kind of touched on, like for the example, the LGBTIQ community. Now in the past, the NPP has very positively and progressively said that they will stand by the rights of the LGBTIQ community. And I think some of them have kind of actively supported. We have a member of parliament from the disabled community. So we have, I think, again I mentioned about the relatively negative statement made by the NPP in relation to the MMDA reform. So I think the Muslim women, Muslim children, girl children in particular have been, for decades been marginalized. And I think there are concerns. There has been a strong movement for the last several years, especially by young Muslim women. I think that needs to be sensitively addressed. And of course, I think the economic problems must be also be looked upon from a human rights angle, ensuring right to food, ensuring right to health.
Yes.
So I think those are not
a lot
just
of discussions about rice and coconuts these days.
Yes, so coconuts and rice is about human rights. So we must know what is the point of having freedom of expression, what is the point of being able to protest, of having a good judiciary if we have nothing to eat, if we are going to die of hunger, or what is the point of all these civil and political rights if you don't have good health care, if you're going to die on the streets without health care, if you have something
access
like a pandemic.
Access to food is a human rights issue,
So
absolutely.
food, health care, even things like education, they're all human rights, and these are acknowledged as rights, particularly through the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, to which Sri Lanka is a party to. So I think we must need to address these as rights as well, and not consider only civil and political rights as human rights.
Right. In fact, we had the current Prime Minister on our roundtable, and the NPP is an evolution of the JVP, and they are on the progressive front, right? The Vamanchika side of things. So, when Harsha was here, he said, look, that's the red and the pink. The pink ideology versus the red ideology. So, he was saying it'll be interesting to see who will win the battle within the NPP. Whether the red ideology will be the one that will be stronger and have more representation, or whether it'll be the more progressive front, represented by Dr. Harini and so on. But to the point that you were making, one of our members, Tassie, I mean, she expressed disappointment that there was lack of Muslim representation at cabinet level, also female representation at deputy minister level. I think there's only 2 in the government in terms of sort of ministers, two females in the entire government, if I'm not mistaken. All the entire slate of deputy ministers were men. So I think. We see a good start. Like you said, nothing can be perfect. It's never going to be perfect from day one. And they have their own demons that they need to overcome to address some of these issues. But, we can give them the benefit of the doubt, right? To prove through their actions that they are willing to be the change that the country needs.
I think the benefit of the doubt has been given electorally twice. And it's possible that they might even get a third and a fourth.
Right.
If there are elections in, So the election is the opportunity to give the benefit of the doubt. Beyond that, I think it's the opposite.
Right. Accountability.
Citizens should always doubt those in power. And always strive to hold accountable those who are in power. Because the whole system of democratic governance is based on citizens not having full trust. Unlimited trust in their rulers.
Very interesting, because even within our group, we were having discussions like how long do we wait until we start holding them accountable? I mean, my view is like day one. We can wait for outcomes, but in terms of their promises, transparency, acting in good faith, sticking to their promises, I mean, that doesn't have to wait for weeks or months or days or years or whatever. That can happen on day one. I mean, they can prove through their actions that they are willing to be the change in political culture that they promise the people.
Actions must speak louder than words. Certain processes, for example, I think having a new constitution definitely needs some time.
Right.
Because you can't bring in a new constitution tomorrow. And that will be a very authoritarian process if that happens. So that kind of a certain changes require time. And also I think changing institutional cultures, whether it's about corruption or police repression, also takes time. Now, for example, yesterday we saw the police stopping a peaceful protest, related to prisoners' rights. Obstructing a protest just yesterday, just the 11th of December, day after.
Also, if I can just interject, one of the Human Rights Day commemorations, the CID were videoing people and things like that. So things like that are still going on, which is sort of intimidation. Right?
It is. It's not sort. It is
intimidation.
It is a continuation of old practices, but sometimes, I think the changing that culture of surveillance, repression might take some time.
Will take time.
You know? But what we need is a positive signs from the political establishment.
Yeah.
No, I don't think the president or the minister in charge of the police gave orders for the police to restrict the protest or the march that was happening yesterday.
Right.
No, I find it difficult to believe that. No, but we need to see some positive action. From the senior police officers, in responding to such acts. We have seen a few where certain kind of acts by the police have been led to some actions by the more senior police officers, particularly the acting Inspector General of Police. So I think what we are looking for is actions that are more kind of indicative of positive progress. And also statements, kind of more policy statements that indicate positive progress. Now, refusal to repeal the PTA and saying the PTA will be reformed or replaced is a negative statement.
Yeah.
Saying that the MMDA reforms will not happen is a negative, anti-human rights statement. Using the PTA to arrest people who are from different political camps, as we saw in the last few weeks, in different parts of the country, in Portlasgama, in Baddegama, and in Mardana, is a very bad sign. So I think we don't want to see these signs in the early days of a government. When we see this, I think we citizens need to be vigilant and we need to hold the political establishment to account. While we don't expect radical reform immediately, like tomorrow, but I think we do expect some indicators through actions and also through kind of significant statements that leaders make.
Okay. So two more things before we wind up. We've taken quite a bit of your time. So one, how do you feel about the media landscape and the reporting of human rights violations? I feel that our media seems to not focus too much on it, and that is why it's not top of mind for a lot of people. I mean, we are talking about it. I mean, some of the things that you bring up, like issues with the Malaya community and things like that. Never seems to get any kind of media coverage. Do you see that as an issue in this country?
Yes, I think the Sri Lankan society is very ethnically polarized. Particularly as Sinhalese Tamils, and we see that in the political establishment. We see that in voting patterns, and that is also true for the media. I think that's one dimension I think that we need to be very conscious about. So I read only Sinhala and English. I don't read Tamil. But in the Sinhalese and the English media that I read, I see relatively very little related to human rights issues concerning the North and Eastern Tamils.
Right.
But from my Tamil friends, I understand also, although I can't read personally, that the Tamil media also gives prominence to issues and concerns that affects Tamils and less to issues and concerns that affect Sinhalese. Right. So it seems that this ethnic polarization is something that we need to overcome. And I think this requires some institutional commitments. We do require people with language skills, translators, interpreters. For this. We do need facilities like transportation for people to travel up and down. So if media is serious, particularly large media institutions, they need to invest in these.
Yeah, we have think tanks that sort of look at the coverage. And, recently there was one that they did about the mass graves that, were being excavated. I think there's a couple going on right now, including in Port City. And there was no coverage or very little coverage in the Sinhala media. Yeah. And then majority of coverage in the
Tamil media.
In the Tamil media. So I think there's definitely our media landscape is skewed like
and also I think we need more professionalism and integrity in media. So we have seen in the past how media behaves terribly in cases. I think one of the good case studies what we have heard about is Dr. Shafi's case.
They're complicit in that case.
So there are many other examples where the media was complicit in promoting hate against certain individuals and communities. Even I remember being portrayed as a LTT supporter by certain leading state media and private media institutions back about 10 years ago.
Right.
So there are many people who have suffered because I think this shows that the media is biased and unprofessional, and many leading media institutions are owned by politicians or relatives of politicians in Sri Lanka.
Also state media. Now, if you look at the coverage of the speaker's credentials issue, state media carried little or nothing. I mean,
Right.
there was a study by a think tank, and it was only really the private media that carried it.
Right.
That means state media still feels the need to give cover to whatever administration's in power.
Right. Yeah.
So I think the whole role of state media, I think maybe needs to be reviewed by the government, because
what we need is, I think, more not state media but public media.
Public media.
So that media that will act in the best interest of the public. But I think I've seen glimpses of positive things. For example, I think I remember a particular period in 2016, 17, 18, the Sunday Observer used to carry, I think, did very good reporting, even in cases like the one we referred to on Dr. Shafi and several other cases. And even there was certain space for even dissenting views coming from the northern province. I myself used to occasionally write to the Sunday Observer at that time. I was never a staff member, but as an occasional writer. So we've seen glimpses of what's possible, and I think we need to build on it. But I think we also need to be fair to our media community. The media community has been repressed a lot. So there has been killings, enforced disappearances, assaults, and all that.
That's
arson attacks, which have not been resolved. So I think the media constantly lives in fear that these things can happen again. I think that affects their professionalism and the way they work. But also I think we need to look at the benefits, the payments that media gets. So I know that people who get like 30,000 rupees, 35,000 rupees for full-time work as journalists, and which is definitely not adequate.
Right.
So what happens is then they are tempted to work for another website that will also provide them additional income. And then they become more dependent on advertisers, for example, some of the private media, because of their
which
financial
will compromise you in certain ways.
Yes. So how do you report labor issue, for example, in a company that provides you major advertising income, whether it's for a website or a newspaper? Will you be able to report independently, and will you be able to provide the perspective of the worker who claims oppression or violation by the management and the ownership? So I think these kind of financial issues are also things that I think we need to look at when we think of the media landscape. But there's a lot to change, I think, in the media landscape. But we must also acknowledge the very good journalists who have been working at very heavy odds in Sri Lanka for many years and decades. Unfortunately, some of them have been killed, some of them have been disappeared, and some of them had to flee the country. But there are still people who are remaining and who do a very good job.
Right, and today good journalism is consequential, right? I mean, in Keheli Rambukwella's case, it was activism and good journalism. People like Namin Vijayadasa, writing about that issue, bringing it to the forefront.
Yes.
That gave the activists the courage to fight.
Right.
And then eventually the overwhelming sort of, it became so overwhelming that the government had to act.
Yes.
Although they tried their best to protect one of their own.
Yeah. So we do have problems, but I think we need to acknowledge and appreciate and support the courageous and the professional journalists, particularly investigative journalists that we have today. And also, today, in a way, everyone can become a journalist or do some parts, some journalist role, because of the technology.
Journalism to a certain extent. But so finally, Ruki, I think one area that the government can distinguish itself is on the anti-corruption issues and bringing resolution to a lot of these killings, disappearances. There's a lot of hope that people had. We've been highlighting things like the Richard D'Souza case, Lasantha Vikramatunga, Pradeep, Taligoda, Keith Noyer, Wasim Tajuddin case, more recently Dinesh Shafter, Easter attacks. I mean, there's so many more, Ratu Paswan and so many more. I mean, I don't know how far back they are willing to go, or how much evidence still even exists in some of these cases and so on. Are you hopeful that we will see some resolution? I mean, do you think it's even important to resolve these cases?
I think it's very important, and I am hopeful that a few individual cases will be, there'll be accountability in the case of few individual high-profile cases. But I'm also very upset of the negative signs in terms of sudden cases. I think for example, I will take the Mahara prison massacre case. Now, murders that happen in a private residence or on the roadside are different to murders that happen in a
public,
in a highly guarded prison.
Prison,
which is supposed to be run by professional jailers. The fact that the magistrate dealing with it, in Valisara case, have found that this was a crime. And the magistrate have very clearly outlined in the judgment, I read the judgment, that why this is a crime. There was no shooting below the knee, if there were riots or something. So there was it was clearly done with intent to kill. That is the magistrate's preliminary finding. Right. And the magistrate had ordered the arrest of the suspects, which has not happened for over a year. Now, that is very deeply problematic. And in the middle of that comes a letter from the Attorney General saying that they are going to close the case. Of course, magistrate has magisterial power. The Attorney General has the kind of discretion in terms of filing indictments, taking a case to the High Court. But I think for us as a citizen, this is deeply problematic that a killing in the prison can go be closed so easily, particularly when a magistrate has found that there was a crime. Now we take the other prison killing.
It was the same at Valikada as well, right?
In Valikada was slightly different. In Valikada, there was a person who was convicted by High Court, and then the appeal. Later pardoned, that person was not pardoned but acquitted. Through the appeal. Now that's the right of a person to be, to lodge an appeal. And that process has to go on. That is the criminal justice system in Sri Lanka, and that has to go on. But what we have ended up with is killings without killers inside prisons. Now even
crimes without criminals.
Yes,
we've been saying this for years.
Criminals. So like even Ratupaswala is the same. Now the person who is responsible was acquitted. That is the judicial decision. But okay, if that person is not guilty, who is guilty? Because people were killed in Ratupaswala. So the question is, who are the criminals, who are the murderers? So that's why I am not so optimistic, despite the government's pronouncements on holding some people, some cases, criminally accountable. The other thing that I already mentioned, I think, is the large-scale crimes that happen in the context of the war. Large-scale killings that happen cannot be ignored. So instead of focusing only on individual cases, I think there has to be some focus on the wartime atrocities as well. When I find that
at least an acknowledgement.
Acknowledgement, and there has to be a process. Now, even like the presidential commissions appointed, like the LLRC, Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, appointed by the then President Mahinda Rajapaksa, has dealt with certain cases. Certain other presidential commissions, like the killing of Prabhakaran's son, Balachandran. Then the killing of female media personality, Zaipriya. So things like that have said to be the killing of people who surrendered with white flags. So even presidential commissions of inquiries have pointed out that these are things that should be investigated further. Now not to look at it, to ignore it, I think is going to be very problematic in terms of ensuring accountability. So I think that is something that I find very problematic in the NPP's manifesto, and also the general discourse by the NPP. So as opposed to dealing with few prominent individual cases, like Lasantha Wickramatunge and Sivaram and like that, that's good that the NPP has given priority to few cases at the beginning, which will hopefully lead to others, but they should not ignore the wartime atrocities.
Right. I think if they're serious about winning public trust and representing all communities, I think they need to look at these sort of transitional justice issues that people like you have been highlighting over the years.
Right.
So, Ruki, thank you so much. We covered quite a bit.
Right.
Is there anything that we missed that you want to highlight before we wind up? Or
okay, maybe I would say that usually dramatic improvements in human rights situation in any society often comes with dramatic political change.
Yes. Right.
So dramatic major political change gives us an opportunity to bring about dramatic improvements in the human rights situation, which involves preventing human rights violations from happening now, today, present, and in the future, but also ensuring justice for the human rights violations that happened in the past. So I hope that we have seen a dramatic, I think, political change. I think we first saw it in 2022 on the streets. We have seen it now electorally.
I think there's a direct line from that to this.
I think it's very connected.
Yeah.
I think the street revolution contributed massively or led to the electoral revolution. So we will wait with hope and see that the street and the electoral revolutions that brought about political change will also bring about major improvements in the human rights situation.
Right. Thank you so much, Ruki. So usually we end the discussion with a quote that Leisha finds. So Leisha, thank you for the quotes, which I will read now. She's found two quotes. The first is, to deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. That's a quote by Nelson Mandela. I'm sure you won't disagree with that. And then the second quote basically says, enforced disappearances is an abhorrent crime that not only affects direct victims, but also their families and instills fear in society as a whole. This is by Fatou Bensouda, prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. So I think two very apt quotes that Leisha has found. So Ruki, thank you so much. And I think we'll wind it up today.
Yeah.
I missed the rest of my gang today. Normally we have a much larger
I missed
group.
them too.
Yeah, we have Chris and Ani Maubrey and Leisha and the others who join us. And maybe, for the next one they'll be here.
Yep.
But
thank you for having me.
No, thank you, Ruki. Thank you for sort of, opening eyes to a topic that actually people fear to talk sort of openly about. So we hopefully we've opened a few hearts and minds.
Right.
To the rather difficult and challenging subject to discuss. So that's it from day 320 at GGY. I don't know whether we count this as a day, since it's a discussion today. We'll have that debate with the team. And with that, thank you and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.